It's not the Fort Knox kind of gold. Uh, so saw many things, had the opportunity to ask many questions. The thing I do want to talk about, because this is a comfort to so many parents, there was one building that stood out among all the rest. And the buildings are made not of stone, not of wood, but of a material that has a light in it. Now, that I don't want it to sound too Las Vegasy, but it was a gentle, welcoming light. But this particular building glowed with a light that had a warmth to it. And I asked what building that was, and I was stunned when they said, "That is the nursery." And I responded, "Nursery in heaven?" And they said, "Yes, James, this is where the souls of aborted children, or children who die in their innocence from disease, or come back here. And each soul is so precious to God that they're cared for. They grow at a different rate because they're not growing a physical body. So they grow at about 3 times the rate that we do, that a child does on Earth. And this is where they take care and so on. Of the little souls that have been unwanted or have died. And I had no idea how this part of the story would have such an effect on women who have lost children or who have had to have an abortion at a time in their life when they had no other option. And it's been a blessing to explain to these parents that their child lives. Their child lives. And so, anyway, getting right to the main event. After showing me much more, we came back to paradise, the ground of paradise, which was outside the walls, I learned. And I was looking once again at the horses, and I realized I hadn't seen my guardian for a while. So I turned to look for him, and I saw him, and he was about no more than maybe 40, 50 feet away on a small rise. And but when I looked, he was bent over, almost in a kneeling position, and was holding up a book. And facing him was a more magnificent figure than even the angels, but I couldn't see the face, and it was in profile to me. Do you know how you drive down a hot road on a warm summer day and there's a shimmer on the pavement? There was this kind of shimmer covering the features of this magnificent being but clearly he was reading what the guardian was holding up. And I took note of the book that the guardian had taken out of his sleeve. And it was as thin as a cheap roadside diner menu. And suddenly the awareness came over me that what the guardian was holding was the book of my life. And instead of it being a book filled with good deeds and kindness, all I had to show for a life that I thought was the epitome of success was this tiny, tiny book. Thin. Charles Dickens wrote a wonderful line when he wrote, "Mankind should have been my business." And instead, it was all about the pursuit of wealth. And all I had to show for it, although I thought myself a kind person, all I had to show for it was this little thin book. I am determined, fellas, that to live my life now, that when I go back, if they permit me to go back, when they open the book of my life for this chapter, they're going to need 3 angels and a forklift to get it open. So anyway, I'm watching, and this figure is leaning forward, clearly intent on the little bit that's written in there, and suddenly the figure straightened up, and the angel folded the book, put it in his sleeve and disappeared. And then this magnificent figure turned toward me.
5 words you pronounce wrong 2 years before your brain starts shutting down. Dementia is now known as type 3 diabetes, according to the Mayo Clinic.
And as he turned from profile to direct on, suddenly the shimmer, gradually the shimmer that had covered his features vanished. And I found myself face to face with none other than Jesus Christ, the Son of God, someone that I thought was just some old Jewish legend that that people had made up to create whatever. And I'm looking at this figure and the magnificence of this figure, not just the look of intense love and concern for me, but this golden light flowed out of him from all, seemed to start at his head and flow down his body. And it was light that behaved like slow moving water. It flowed off him and it flowed down that slope. And I fell to my knees and tried to crawl toward him. I had to get closer. And it was as though I had finally come home, that I had found what I had searched for all my life. And I started to crawl toward him and to get closer. And then his eyes looked into mine. And when I looked into those eyes of gray and green and blue, I was lost in the love of eternity. This magnificent creature knew me too, but this was a creature of love and forgiveness and desired to know me better. And for a split second, and Randy, you probably experienced this too, although my intellect knew better, it was as though when my eyes met his, it was as though I was the only one in creation, the only one he had ever created. He knew me that intimately and loved me that deeply. And it was it was a moment that I knew from now on that whatever happened to me, I was his forever. But I just wanted to be around him. And I tried to crawl closer to him. And 2 guardians appeared beside me and held me back. And I struggled free and continued to climb toward him. And suddenly he raised his right hand. And there was no mistaking what the gesture meant. He was still smiling in a gentle way. But this was a definite command to stop. And I remember the feeling inside of me of not being allowed to come closer. And I waited with bated breath, I guess, if I was breathing. But I was just completely enveloped in the love of his eyes. And then I guess I must have taken another step or 2 or crawled on my knees. And all of a sudden he raised his hand. Higher, and ready when he raised his hand, his cloak fell back, and I saw the remains of crucifixion. And then he looked intently at me, and he began to speak to me. And people say to me, what did it sound like? How can I possibly, I attempt to, but how can I possibly be accurate? But suddenly I heard his voice, and with him, unlike the angels, which was more of a telepathy, not telepathy, but a mind thing, Jesus' face moved just as you or I would speak to each other. And then I heard the voice of the Son of God, and it stunned me that he knew my name. He knew me. And he looked at me with the gentlest of smiles, hand still raised, meaning to not come forward. And he said to me, James, my son, this is not yet your time. Go back and tell your brothers and sisters of the wonders we have shown you. And his hand slowly came down and crossed over his left. And I was overwhelmed with the fact that he knew my name. But more than that, I was now coming to the realization that I wasn't being allowed to stay, and I began to plead, I began to beg, please let me stay. This is what I've yearned for all my existence. I just want to be wherever you are. Please don't send me away. Please let me stay. And I remember saying this, please let me stay. I won't be any trouble. Can you imagine saying that to the Son of God? I won't be any trouble. But I was desperate. And suddenly 2 guardians appeared beside me and lifted me from the ground and turned me around and were carrying me back down the path. And I wrenched my shoulder away to turn to beg one more time to allow me to stay. And Jesus was gone. But standing exactly in the place where he had stood was this magnificent warrior angel that had greeted me. And all of a sudden, he began to expand. He grew even taller than 15 feet, and he put his wings out to their full magnificence. And they spread out and upward in this beautiful gold, and he was surrounded with light, and the message was clear that he was bearing the way forward for me. And suddenly, I feel the angels hold me again. Everything goes dark, and I'm in a black tunnel, and I can hear water, and it's cold, and it's painful, and I feel like I'm descending at tremendous speed, but unlike the tunnel of light, there's no beauty, there's just darkness. And I'm going down this steep descent, and suddenly, I guess they tell me that I scared the daylights out of the nurses because I'd been, of course, triaged, and they had told my wife that there was no hope of me coming back, that there was no brain sign, no sign of dreaming, no sign of hallucinating, nothing. And brain sign, of course, is the measure of death, not heartbeat. They, of course, had triaged me, had me hooked up to everything. There was complete renal failure of all my organs, and the doctors had said to Lorraine that they would keep me until our children arrived to say goodbye, and then they would recommend that she pull the plug on the machinery that was flowing blood through my organs. And suddenly, I come upright and scared the daylights out of the nurse, she told me, and later, screaming around all the tubes because I was intubated, and they ran and got my wife and said, "Come quickly, Lorraine's a nurse." She ran into the room and she couldn't believe it. She said, my eyes were as big as I was trying to orient from the beauty of heaven to lying on a gurney. And she climbed up on the bed with me and started to cry, and they were watching my blood pressure go back to normal. All my organs started to operate again. So eventually they pulled the tube out so I could speak clearly, and my throat was terribly sore and raw. And I looked into my wife's pretty face, and I said, Lorraine, I saw Jesus, and Jesus has horses. Of all the things I could have said to her, Jesus has horses. And I'm back.
Well, there's so many directions we could go after everything you've shared, but I want to be conscious of our time, because we are starting to get to the end of our time together today. In terms of what you understood is why you came back, what your mission, your calling was on this side of your heaven journey, what shifted for you? How was your mission different on this side of your experience?
Just let me quickly tell you this. What the words that Jesus said to me. James, he knew my name, my son. He's the father of us all. This is not